Hello YouTube, Mr. Gibson Guy here. Thanks for coming by and dropping by to visit the channel. This is the home of vintage film photography back from the days of manual focus cameras, so some with manual exposure, some with automatic exposure. But in those golden years from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when photography was really interesting, and that's kind of the basis of what I do on my photography videos on this channel. And today we're going to be, I'm introducing you to a new camera that I just got, and we're going to work that into the overall discussion, which is looking at the what do you call them? The top line or the flagship cameras of each of the 5 big Japan camera companies. We're being more specific in that, and we're looking at the flagship cameras from each of these companies from the 1970s period versus the flagships from those same 5 companies in the 1980s. And I have the examples of just about every one of them here, so we'll be looking at them. But we also want to relate that to current day price values. So I'll just kind of go over this as you know, because we can make a practical part of that, and we start to recognize why this costs this and this costs this. Okay, there was I don't want to say 2 tiers, but there was several different levels of production that was going on. Some cameras were built for professional photographers, and that was kind of like money is not much of an object. It's just, what can we build the best? Because pros get to write it off on their taxes or something, so they'll buy more expensive stuff. And then we have to contrast that with the manufacturers that wanted to turn out cameras as cheaply as possible so they could get in at a lower price point and undersell the others and make their money in volume. And they did plenty of volume in those years of the 70s and the 80s and then the 90s, and then things started to fall off, and then we went to cell phones. But in this golden age, this is when cameras, film cameras with manual focus, were really at a premium and in the most demand before they got superseded with technical stuff, electronic gadgets and gizmos. So we're looking at those. And so people, I think Canon really started the idea of making cameras with a lot of plastic parts, a lot of stamped out parts, a lot of electronic parts, and simplified assembly for their factory workers that put these things together. Because if you look at what's involved in like a 1960s mechanical camera, they are very complex machines, like a watch that had all these gears and levers and pulleys and all these things that were going on inside, all miniature little stuff, and it's expensive stuff to make. And miniaturized more and more and more, and then they found they could save a lot of money by going to stuff that was more electronic, because then they could just plug it in. But that's what we see here. When we look at these 70s cameras, we're going to see they tend to be more mechanical, more labor intensive, and heavier and more metal. As we go into the 80s, we see more use of plastics, more electronics, less mechanical stuff, and cameras that are easier and easier generally to assemble. Professional cameras, top of the line, flagship cameras accepted. So let's take a look at these. So the price part, let me say this. The basic consumer cameras, somewhat from the 80s, somewhat from the 70s, mostly from the 80s, those cameras with a lot of plastic and a lot of electronic parts, we're going to generally see on today's market going from $30, $60, $90, stuff like that. They built a lot of them. There's a whole bunch of them out there, and they the same pictures as the ones that are $400 or $500, but they don't command the price because there's lots and lots of them. People know they're easy to get. You know, like an example, I would say the Nikon EM. I have an EM, and that used to be, it would sell for like $30. I've watched the prices gone up. Now it's more towards 60 plus, 70, stuff like that with the E-series lens. So the prices have increased on those, but they're generally still going to be under $120. Then we start looking into the cameras that are a lot more like the pro cameras. Some of these ones, they're not quite flagship level cameras, but they're definitely not consumer level cameras. You know, I'm thinking like an OM2 or something like that. And those cameras are going to be $100, $120, $130, $140, $150. An AE1 or an A1, something like that. Those are going to get a higher price because they're not just the basic, all electronic, all the camera does it, you just focus and push the button kind of type of cameras. So those are going to be around the $100, $150 range. Then we start to get into the, I'm going to say the early flagships, the ones that came out in the 70s. Those are going to be cameras that are going to be around, starting around $200, maybe going up a little above that from the 1970s ones. Then we go up to the flagships that changed over in 1980. In 1980, you're going to see here it's going to be a big year. And these more modernized ones are, they use a little more plastic and definitely have more electronics in them. They're less mechanical, but they're still a very high level of camera. It doesn't use much plastic. It's going to use a lot of metal, a lot of glass, and offer a lot of high-end features. And those cameras, then all of a sudden we start to jump up to the $300 to $400 to pushing $500 range today for those cameras from 1980. So that kind of gives us an idea of where our prices are and why. So let's look at these flagships. We're looking at the top of the line stuff for each decade here. And I'm going to start out here. I've thought a lot about this. Olympus is different than all the other companies. In 1970 there was a top 4, and then this camera came along with Olympus, and there was all of a sudden the big 5 camera companies instead of the big 4, and that was first the OM1. You can see this. All right, the OM1 camera had a lot of effect on a lot of cameras. Some people would say, oh, well, it's not really a flagship, but it really was designed to be a professional camera that was very small and light. And they succeeded in doing that. They succeeded wildly, leaving all the other camera companies, except maybe Canon, trying to catch up to them. So it was a very influential camera. And I would say, it's I'll give a giveaway here. It's the 1970s 1970s flagship camera from Olympus, because there's the OM1 was their 70s flagship, and the OM4T was their 1980s flagship, because basically for their upper level cameras, Olympus only made 2 cameras, the OM1 and the OM4. And everything else was based on those 2 cameras. So while Minolta was making cameras left and right, this and this and this and this, Olympus was doing it all those couple of decades with the OM1 and the OM4. And so that makes this their flagship. It's a little bit different. So this was from 1972, and had a big effect on all cameras because they all had to get small and light. then as promised, in the 1980s, actually started in 82 at first, we had the OM4, and it graduated into the OM4T when it really matured and became really valuable in 1983 or 1986 for the titanium model. And this is a spectacular camera. One of the only ones that has an eyepiece adjustment. You can set the diopters. So I'm older and my eyes are not as accommodating as they used to be. So I have to wear reading glasses for close-up work. But with this diopter adjustment, I have this camera set so I look through it and I can see it perfectly. I got 20/20 vision when I use this camera. And that's something that only I see in my D5200 Nikon and in the Pentax that we're going to talk about in a minute. So this one jumps up the price. Well, the OM1 is usually like $100 or so camera still, even though it's like kind of the early flagship. The OM4T now is $300-400 for these if you want one that works, and a lot of people want them, so they are very much in demand. Flagship for the 1980s from Olympus. Next, we'll look at the Nikons. Of course, their flagship for the 1970s was the F2. This is an F2A with the MD3 motor drive and MB2 battery pack. But this camera was the camera to be in 1971 when it appeared. By 1980 it had become a boat anchor, but this was at the beginning in 1970. This, the 1970s started out with, look what we can do now with photography. So the F2 and all of its iterations, and it lived from 71 to 79 when it was replaced by Nikon's new flagship, of course, the F3 high eye point. This one, of course, has an MD4 motor drive on it and a 50mm f1.4 Nikkor on it. So as it's usually presented there, it's top-of-the-line form. And this was a great camera. This is the ones that, when you find them nowadays, it's going to cost you $400 and up to get these, which is the same price as they were when they came out in 1980. So these have held value, even though they are archaic, out-of-date relics. They get just the money that they used to get when it was the latest thing. F3, the 1980s flagship for Nikon. Now, some of these dates vary somewhat from one to another, but Nikon and Canon stay pretty similar. I'm picking up here a Canon A1, and this is the flagship for the Canon A series, which started with the AE1, but the AE1 is not the flagship. The A1 was the multi-mode, do-everything flagship, although it's all electronic and all plastic, except for the bottom piece. The bottom plate is brass on it. But I'm using this one as a substitute here to get us to the 1980s, when Canon introduced their 1980s flagship in 1980, the Canon new F1. And by presenting you the new F1, we can point out that the 70s flagship for all of the Canon line was the old F1. So it wasn't called the Canon old F1 until the Canon new F1 came along. Then the old F1 became known as the old F1. But that represented the 1970s flagship for Canon. And those cameras, like most of the 1970s flagships, go for around 200 up towards the 300 range. And this, the new F1 from 1980, just like the F3, goes for $400 and up. It has an even faster motor drive too. So that's flagships for Canon. They very much follow in line with the flagships for Nikon. Now this one, this is Minolta, always marches to their own drummer. They follow a different beat. This is Minolta's first flagship, came out in 1981. Mine is an X1, it says there, but that's the Japanese designation because this was originally in the Japanese market. In the US market, this was called the XK. And there were several versions of this, all during the 1970s, and it went away. And this was kind of Minolta attempting to get their X series camera started, but they had to go through quite a bit. They did the X1, and that didn't quite get off the ground that much. And then they did the XE series, and that got a little bit further, but didn't really make it. And then they came out with their XD series, which we will see. And after the XD series, they came out with their XG series. And after the XG series, they came out with they took the XG series and converted it into the X700. But back at the XD series, this was really Canon's 1980s flagship camera, even though it came out in 1976. But we're not the numbers don't always work out exactly right. Because after the XD, they followed the Canon A1 down the road of let's make cameras that are plastic and electronic and cheap to make and low priced. And that's what they did with the XG series, the XG7, and they moved it up a little bit to the XG9 and moved it down to the XG1 and the XGM, and those were very basic cameras, while the XD11 was a real top-line camera. It was one of the finest cameras made. It became a Leica for a while also. This one has an auto under on it, but it's hard to consider it a pro camera because it was really aimed at the advanced amateur more than the pros. Most of these cameras, let me do this. We got one last one, and that takes us to our camera of the day. This is from Pentax. Oh, it's missing a lens. Look at that. This is the Pentax MX, and this was Pentax version to replace the K2 DMD to be their professional level camera, which was made after the OM1, being very small and lightweight, yet having pro features like auto winders, motor drives, flash, data backs, and intervalometers, and even 250 exposure backs for bulk film, all in a little tiny camera. But the problem with this is Pentax came out with this in '75, the same as they came out with the ME, same year, which was kind of like an MX, but it was aimed at the amateur photographer, and it had auto exposure, while this one was all mechanical, like an OM1. And so this was a wonderful camera that came out about 3 years after its time had come. So they were late getting this out, and it lasted a very short time. It's an excellent camera, wonderful mechanical match needle camera. Not match needle, it's got match LEDs like a Nikon FM. But this one's missing a lens. That's because the camera of the day after the Pentax MX was this one. If you can read this here? I think you can see it, yeah. This is the Pentax LX. It looks like ILX, but those are actually Roman numerals. LX, the L is Roman numeral for 50, X is for 10. 50 plus 10 is 60. And 1980, there's that year again, was the 60th anniversary of SI Pentax. So they made their 80s professional camera, the LX, for their 60th anniversary in 1980. And this camera was very much like the Canons and the Nikons and the Minolta XK, because if you push this button here and push this knob here, you can slide off the finder. And then you can see there's the focusing screen in there. And this one, it had all the features of a Nikon F3 or a Canon new F1, but it also had some features of its own that they did not have, because this was a compact, lightweight camera, much like the Pentax MX. It's about the same size and just about the same weight, but it's a full-featured professional camera with all the shutter speeds, electronically and mechanically. This one, the shutter speeds from 1/60th of a second on down are all electronic, controlled by the battery. And then above that, 1/90th of a second and up 1/25th, and all the ones up to 2000 are all mechanical speeds on this. So without batteries, you still have all your shutter speeds that you can use working. They came up with some different design ideas with this one. Pentax kind of went their own way, where the F3 and the new F1 are very similar cameras. This one goes in some different directions. One of the things, when I had been watching the LX cameras for a long time on eBay. I wanted to get one, and I would look through them every couple of days or every week or so and just read through some of the ads and see for something that jumped out at me. And nothing really did. And then just the other day I was looking through and I saw this one. Didn't have the lens. The lens was borrowed from the MX. But I was this camera and this auto winder that came with it. And it indicated that it was kind of dirty and probably needs some cleaning up and needs some lubrication, maybe some adjustments. But it said the camera and the auto winder work in the ad. Anyway, that is not exactly correct. When I got this, it took me a while to figure it out, but there is a button that you push down here and it loosens up the battery pack so you can get the battery out. And whoever was selling this didn't know how to open the battery pack, because when I took it out there was some Duracells on this battery caddy that had been in there since 1980, and it had a lot of decay and oxidation from rotted batteries, and I threw those away real fast. The battery caddy, fortunately, doesn't have much circuitry to it. It's just contacts and plastic, so I could wash that in the sink. And then I got a pencil eraser and did what I could do on the contacts inside here, kind of clean it out as much as possible. And then I thought, all right, well, let's see if this really will work. Let's see, got to turn on, put a lens on, so you can see the lens comes off. And, oh, works pretty good. It coming up to there, to the end of the counter there. So, sounds like it works, doesn't it? It winds, it resets the shutter, it clicks, and it makes a lot of noise. Usually auto winders are kind of soft, but they're not usually that fast either. And I did this research on this when I saw the auto winder, and Pentax made a motor drive and a auto winder for the LX. Nowadays, if you, from the research that I did just quickly on a couple pages of eBay, if you want the motor drive, you can get it for $100. If you want the LX auto winder, you can get it, but it's going for about $150. Now, wait a minute, Mr. Gibson guy, what's going on here? Motor drives are more expensive than auto winders. Well, yes, they are, but there's things that happened. The auto winder is a 6-volt motor, and it has that little battery compartment that you saw on it that holds 4 AA batteries inside the winder itself. The motor drive looks just like this winder, but it's got a whole nother unit that's the same size attached underneath it, which is the NiCad pack, or the nickel cadmium batteries that you can run your motor drive off of. So it's double the length and a lot more heavy. But the bad part is that nickel cadmium batteries like those aren't made anymore. They made a whole bunch of little nickel cadmiums, and they could put them all across here like this, a whole bunch of them right there in a couple of rows, so they could have a whole bunch of those little 1.25 volt batteries that all together would put out 12 or 15 volts, so they could get a real fast motor drive. And they haven't made those things in the last 20 years, and the nickel cadmiums last 2 or 3, maybe 4 years if you're lucky, and then you throw them out and you have to get another one. So all the motor drives don't have a nickel cadmium pack anymore, not one that works, not one that'll hold a charge. So they're all gone, so you can get a motor drive, but you'd have to get an AC adapter to plug it in like that to the wall, and you'd just be limited to how far away from how much cord you have as to where you can take your motor driven camera. But this auto winder is unique here. Pentax LX. This auto winder does something that no other auto winder does. You heard it's a fast auto winder already, but also if you press the rewind button down here and you slide this little lever like this, whoops, there, turn on, button, lever, hear that? That's because this has a little thing that goes up here. See that? Rewinds your film electronically. And that's the only auto winder which has a film rewind built into it. So that's why these auto winders go for $150, but the motor drive, which don't work, goes for $100 or less. So that was kind of cool that I got this. You know, I had to clean it out, but it did work. And I'm still working on getting contact with the batteries. I've been having trouble with battery contact in cameras lately, because this one should work. As I said, all the mechanical speeds work. That's there. Manual speeds. Manual speeds work. So we got all those speeds working, and I just got to get the meter and the auto exposure working, And I think I've got some stuff I can look up on that and get the whole thing going. So that is the story with my new LX. I've been searching for this for a long time, and it finally came home today. And it was kind of beat up on the pentaprism, but I had my black Sharpie and I kind of went over the edges here, and you can't even see anything. It looks perfect now. The rest of the body is fine. And the bottom plate on the camera, just to show you that this was the correct auto winder that went with it, the bottom plate still has the plastic on it from when it was new in the box. So the bottom plate on this camera has never been exposed to air since it was put together in the factory. And it's had the auto winder, of course, on it ever since, because there's no marks on the plastic. So that's the coolest auto winder around. It's 4 batteries, so it's much lighter than any other pro camera with a winder, and it goes plenty fast. It can do all the stuff that you need. A little bit noisy, but you can put up with that. It's silent photography. We don't have recording microphones on these things. Controls are very much like the Pentax MX, which I'm used to. They're all kind of in the same thing, except that this one has auto exposure setting on it, auto exposure, aperture priority, and full metered manual on this. Last thing, lens. I'm going to have to do a 2-part, so in the next couple days the lens is going to show up. I have a very special lens that's coming, that this is going to sit on this camera, and I was crossing my fingers they were both going to come together. But then I thought, boy, that's going to be a really long video. So I'll just do the flagship cameras, and this is the final flagship. So it's kind of like almost the end of my collection, except that I still need to get that old F1 from Canon, because I don't have one of those. And then I'd have all the flagships. So thank you for stopping by the channel, and I'll leave a link. Oh yeah, I'll leave a link to the new one when I get that, whenever the lens comes in, and that'll be a continuation of this. So thanks for stopping by, and until next time, this is Mr. Gibson Guy, and I'm out of here. Bye-bye.